Wales, one of the last major concerts to actually take place was at the Stereophonics concert at the Motorpoint Arena in Cardiff. The problem I think the band faced was that they were caught in the middle of an impossible situation. They were selling tickets, so there had been no official government guidelines with regards to cancelling any concerts, so legally I think if they had cancelled that they'd be liable for refunds and they wouldn't be covered by any insurance. There's no official guidance from the UK or the Welsh government at the time to cancel the shows, and the possibility of having a refund for a mass amount of ticket holders probably one of the reasons also why this show couldn't get cancelled and was actually outside the band's control. So because of the pandemic, overnight live music closed down. Income streams for many touring bands disappeared overnight, and what we're going through now is almost like the equivalent of like growth of grunge, Nirvana in the 90s, killing off quite a lot of hair metal bands coming through from the 80s, early 90s. And also if we think about as well the impact that Napster had on recorded music and the end of the 90s, start of the millennium. At the start of the pandemic, with the loss of live music, a larger focus is actually then focused on towards the impact of streaming on the recorded industry, and also in terms of like the payouts for artists when a lot of their livelihoods had been taken away overnight with everything kind of cancelled, and there's no real set date of when things might actually happen. And we're still in a position now where we're just starting to see things open up again, but like guidance and regulations means that we could see themselves getting locked down and things getting cancelled almost overnight without any warning. In March 2020, Tom Gray founded something called the Brokenrecord Campaign, and this was gaining considerable traction because it was exploring the money that streaming was paying out and the ability for artists to actually make a living, especially those on major labels or like signed to record contracts where the income that they might be getting would be considerably less than what you might be able to raise if you're an independent artist. A lot of these artists as well also highlighting the fact that they were earning money from touring and live music, and with that now no longer possible, their incomes had almost disappeared overnight. And I've seen support from like Luke from Thunder, Katie Tunstall's quite an ardent one. I also know like Public Service Broadcasting, one of the things that they did right at the start of the pandemic is they did a merch sale, and the reason for the merch sale was actually try and raise some money for their crew who would be due to be out of pocket because of loss of earnings from touring. What I want to do with this video is I want to actually explore how we got into this position, how the role of music consumption has actually changed since the end of the 90s, or the traditional model that we saw leading up to the turn of the century. I want to also explore some of the potential routes out of this as well, and what we could possibly look at doing as artists, as musicians, as creators in this field. Before we actually start on that, my name is John Constantine. If you haven't met me before, I'm a recording engineer out of South Wales. My aim with this YouTube channel is I want to try and help artists with recording and music industry advice as they're beginning their careers and actually building foundations throughout. If that sounds like something that you'd be quite interested in, please subscribe to my channel, hit the bell, and you'll be notified whenever a new video goes live. So first question I want to ask is, how did we get here? This can probably be traced back to actually the forming of Spotify just over 10 years ago in 2008. At the time, we were coming out of a hangover from obviously the impact of Napster. Physical sales in the industry had actually started dwindling, and we started seeing an emergence of online consumption with the use of stores like iTunes, but we were still looking at the ownership of products rather than actually streaming songs on demand. Napster, as I mentioned already, had changed the game overnight, and the incomes from traditional sales dropped through the floor, and the industry couldn't really adapt as quickly as it could have. The ones who were more nimble were actually quite good at actually adapting to that. When it came back to Spotify, their business model wasn't actually through the ownership of songs, which had previously been seen with iTunes and online music stores up until that point. What they were looking at trying to do is stream the songs straight from like a server on their end to the user's like devices, so you weren't actually looking at ownership of a track, so you're actually paying almost like per broadcast or a stream. In order to do this, they argued that the royalty fee should be incredibly low because we're looking at thousands upon streams, so you get paid for every single time. But as most of you probably will know, that with physical sales and with digital downloads, you only get paid per one download. You don't get paid if like someone re-downloads a song again and again. If you look at online royalty from Spotify, if you get 1 million plays, it works out at roughly £4,000. That's fine if you're an independent artist. I know people who've actually done all right with this. Where it becomes more complicated is when we go back on to looking at artists who might be signed to a record label, might have other people that need to pay. So if you're a rights holder, you have to pay for like a digital distributor. If you've got a record label, there might be songwriters or teams of people who've been working on that. They'll be also liable to that. So the pie that you've actually got starts off quite big and gradually gets like smaller as record label, management, songwriter, digital distributor, and it kind of gets smaller until you end up with like a smaller section. Broken Record were quoted saying, this is COVID-19, live income is gone, performing rights organisation money is going to dry up shortly. Whatever anger you think there is in the industry now towards streaming, imagine it in 6 months' time, when the last of the money that is in touring musicians' bank account has gone, and when Performing Rights Society, PRS, which is a collection society in the UK, and PPL, which covers sound recording copyright, checks they go through the floor. So what Tom Gray is saying here is that there's a possibility that at the start of this pandemic, we weren't sure what was going to happen, but there was like, they were arguing that like there's the performing rights will cover playing live, playing at festivals, songs being played on like shops, being played over the tannoys at festivals as well. So there's like there's a whole chunk for songwriters and people on the sound recordings where they might not actually earn money because of live music's actually gone, completely disappeared. This has been problematic for such a long time. That's why I call it broken record. There's nothing new about this. I've been saying basically the same things that you've heard a million times, but because of COVID, the complex is completely changed. The problem is that streaming has cannibalized the culture and gave all the income to a very small amount of the market. It always did that. It's just now deeply unhealthy. All this has actually happened, and in the last year, Daniel Ek has actually earned enough money to seriously consider launching a bid to take over Arsenal Football Club alongside Patrick Vieira and Thierry Henry. This isn't entirely Spotify's fault. Obviously, when Spotify started, they had to approach major labels and ask for the rights for their songs to be distributed and appear in Spotify's catalogue. Without that, they wouldn't have actually got the user base in the first place to actually build their business from a point. Basically, if you haven't got what you're looking for, or if not everything that they need is on there, there's a possibility that people might leave. We've seen this in the past with the likes of Taylor Swift pulling her content from Spotify. We've seen, I think, Adele as well, or other people might actually like have a tactic in terms of their launch plan of what they're going to release, when they're going to release it, and it might be that they leave streaming platforms off until they actually recoup their money. I've actually done that with an artist called Marshall Chess, which is Rich from Fire Road. He almost flipped everything on his head. He decided to actually sell the physical copies of the records and recoup the money that he made that actually cost him to actually come in the studio and record the album. Once that had actually been done and he sold that to his fans, he then actually put the music on Spotify. At that point, he'd already made his money back because there's a much higher income. You only had to sell like a couple of hundred records, and he covered the cost of recording, he covered the cost for a few other bits and pieces that you needed with, and then any money that comes in from streaming now is a bonus. In order for Spotify to actually gain access to the major label artist, what they chose to do is actually offer shares in Spotify in return for access to these artists. As a result of that, that meant that when it came to actually promoting Spotify or pushing Spotify, it was almost in the major label's interest. If Spotify became successful, so did they. And whilst payouts of streams for a tiny amount, I'd imagine that most of them would have thought Spotify might see a few years of growth, but eventually it could collapse on itself, and then it was no loss to the labels because they'd still be getting paid a little bit of money, and if that didn't work, then obviously the business model might revert back to like the digital downloads. As it turns out, as we'll see later on, that's something that hasn't quite happened. What we've seen happen over these last few years is Spotify have had a plan for growth. They've actually bought and they've made acquisitions of other businesses that actually support their industry, and also in areas that they wanted to develop. They've bought businesses that support their own business model and provide an opportunity for innovation. This could be from such like podcast platforms such as Anchor. They've looked at blockchain companies, which I imagine is going to be closely related to royalty distribution and rights management. They've also looked into a lot of stuff relating to data analytics, the AI-driven playlist technologies that you might see. And that's one of the reasons why Spotify have been able to grow, is they've been thinking about what's important to our users, what can we do to retain that. Another area that have actually become really popular for Spotify is also podcasts. Now, podcasts don't actually get a royalty per play. Premium subscriber of Spotify, if all you're doing is listening to podcasts all day, then it's a huge win for them because they don't have to pay out a royalty for the podcast plays, whereas music, you do. This is one of the reasons why like they actually decided they wanted to bring someone on massive in the podcasting game, Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan Experience came across, and when they did that, bonus for that happening is there was a 35 billion pound increase on Spotify's evaluation just after the announcement of their partnership. And it's a little bit about Spotify, but what about the current global music landscape? Because this is something that also comes into play when we're looking at Spotify, and we're also looking at what's going on and how do we actually get to this point. So in this video I've included a graph now which is coming from the IFPI, is the global body for the recording industry, so it's to do with the phonographic federation. So this is something where they basically look at all the data from all the different industry bodies. I'll include the link in the description below. So what we're looking at here is like the pattern. So from data from 2001 to 2020, we've actually seen a decline in physical sales, which is the red section on the graph. What this means is like, obviously as physical sales has come along, turquoise bit is actually the digital download. So iTunes actually gets announced around about 2002, 2004, and we can see that kind of starts growing up until about 2014, 2015, and then we've now seen like this rise of streaming. And this is something now, like for the last, up until 2019, 2020, recorded industry has actually been sustained growth. If we just look at 2020, which is the information we have for the last year, streaming now accounts for 62% of the global recorded revenue. 16.2% of all that is actually coming from ad-supported streams, so if you're non-premium members of Spotify, maybe. One of the things that's actually happened is like for the recorded industry on its own, like we've actually still seen sustained growth now over 6-7 years. And this has happened now, if you think as well with regards to a pandemic, the recorded industry hasn't seen a massive change in the impact. With the IFPI, one of the things we have to consider is that it doesn't take into account anything else like music tourism, live music or merchandise. It is fully focusing on the income generated from physical sales, digital downloads or streaming and recorded music. We can actually see that the physical sales have still been dropping down by 4.7, and this is something that's been occurring, which we can actually see on the graph since 2001. I think if we went back a little bit further, I think 1999 we saw a drop. Napster closes in 2000, it goes up again and it starts declining again. So what we actually need to think about is looking at other industry bodies or other areas, kind of get a better picture of what's been going on and what can be done to change about this. So in order to actually look at the sections with live music, I'm going to focus now on the UK because that's where I'm from and that's what I know. UK Music Annual Report explores the state of the industry in the UK over the course of the previous year. The last data that we have is actually covering 2019. According to the report, the UK music economy is worth £5.8 billion to the UK economy as a whole, and it also generated £2.9 billion to the economy in terms of exports worldwide. That's a massive impact when you think that like other industries might have like a deficit where they might be importing more than we're able to export because of physical limitations. From this report, the other thing that we can actually see is that live music contributed £1.3 billion in terms of GVA, which stands for gross value added, and it actually caters for 34,000 jobs. Live music is a gateway to new artists and opportunities to discover new music. Not only have people lost their jobs and still in completely uncertain situations, but artists also lose out on the ability to further increase their revenue and not being able to play shows, not being able to do tour supports and all festivals. And it also means that people aren't able to find new artists quite as easily, because I'm sure loads of you have been to festivals, right? You've gone to see someone and you've been absolutely blown away by one of like support acts, someone at a festival you've like never even heard of, and then like, they become your favourite band. It only takes one song sometimes or one performance and it can change a band's complete career. And this is something that we've lost almost in the last year. The other impact of the closure of live music is UK Music estimates 72% of the music industry are self-employed. Like there was the income support self-assessment, self-employed income support scheme. I know of a lot of people who weren't eligible for that, and it was through no fault of their own, but it was definitely something that like there were people who kind of fell through the cracks and they weren't supported, so they've had to find other jobs and move outside the industry. It might be that they'd be able to come back and actually restart working again, but there's no guarantees of any of this, which is probably the most terrifying thing about the whole pandemic situation. And part of the UK Music Report actually highlights the expected drop in live music over the next year, and also like the surrounding economies as well. So things like music tourism, so people coming to actually visit things like Abbey Road Studios, going up to Liverpool for the Cavern Clubs or like the Beatles tour, that actually brings in £4.7 billion on its own, which is absolutely nuts. That doesn't actually get contributed to music industry because it's concentrating around tourism, but that's a whole area. So like that might include things like Glastonbury Festival. People might come from all over the world to come visit that, or Reading and Leeds Festival. In comparison to live music, I've mentioned already it's £1.3 billion to the UK economy. In 2019, I got this information from the Commons Library research briefings, and it's about the fishing and agriculture industry. They contributed 446 million to the UK economy. The only reason I'm bringing fishing up, I'm not saying it's like any less of a trade, anything like that. Only reason I'm bringing it up is that it's been in the news a lot recently in relation to Brexit, and obviously it's a very emotive issue regarding the fishing rights, the borders, and like sending warships to France. Again, arts and music doesn't always get, sometimes gets ignored in the industry, and as a professional, I just want to highlight the importance of music and live music as an export, as an income to the industry, and something that like gets overlooked a little bit too much. So at the present time with pandemic, it's a bit unsure, a lot of limited opportunities for tourism, and the other thing that we haven't really thought about is the impact of Brexit on touring, because there's a whole new set of loopholes that we've got to explore and entertain now, which haven't really been thought about, or not had, almost skipped aside for the time being, because we haven't been able to go out. But it's something that this is going to get exacerbated even more. So the next few years with live music is going to be incredibly interesting in relation to income for artists. Before the turn of the century, one of the things that tours were, it was almost seen as a loss leader. So that means that it was expected to lose money, provide an opportunity to sell albums. Obviously, that's actually turned on its head now, where it's almost like the album is the loss leader. The income from music for artists now is actually coming from touring. And this might have been highlighted that the shift could possibly actually been taken back to when Robbie Williams did a 360 deal with a record label, where they actually recognised that, okay, the album was important, but just as important was the income he was making from merch, from TV appearances, live performances and shows. So basically like the label would actually invest in that, and they get like a portion of everything. And that was probably might have been the first area like awareness where they realised, okay, like merchandise helps that. These days albums are now seen as a promotional tool for artists to go back on their own. road in order to make money and survive. Potential income to these labels and that independent artists may not be the same level as it was in the 90s or 2000s. The money probably be more made on merch sales, collectibles, and then we're looking at innovating the market. So something that Kiss did really well was actually looking at doing exclusive access for VIP members for their fan clubs to sound checks and doing meet and greet. And I know that other artists who are more established have actually started doing the meet and greets for fan bases. It's like another element for like super fans to actually support artists. Going back to the Broken Record, going back to Tom Gray, said the cultural delusion around the glamour of music, which is for the most part portrayed and pushed by the musicians themselves in order to maintain the appearance of success. Even very successful musicians and artists that you've heard of do not make enough money from recorded music to even pay their rent, unless you're on a stratosphere level like Taylor Swift, Ed Sheeran. As I've mentioned, if there's a slice of the pie going down, then it's going to be much harder to actually sustain your income. There's no real argument against a little bit later on about why that might not always be the case, or why it might not be argued as being fair. And what I want to do is just take a sidebar a little bit and let's look at another industry and explore video on demand and explore like Netflix, the early days of Netflix. Blockbuster, at the time when Netflix launched the online video service, they were still actually the giants of the market. Blockbuster was still focusing on like bricks and mortars, physical sales and physical products. But Blockbuster were offered to buy Netflix at an early stage and they actually turned it up, and Blockbuster decided to launch their own online portal. And what I think they did is they copied the look and feel and the general appearance of Netflix at the time to launch their own thing. If you just had like a screenshot of the two, they both look visually appealing, but what Blockbuster didn't take into account is they didn't have data on their viewers. All that information paints up a big picture of what the viewer wants, so then Netflix can recommend similar things. So if you like this, other viewers who watch this like that. And so the user experience with Blockbuster wasn't as good. So Blockbuster's online service didn't do as well as Netflix, and eventually now we're in a position where I think the only Blockbuster left is available as an Airbnb in Alaska or somewhere like Northwest America. So this is something, again, when we go back to it, like Spotify have taken obviously massive interest in the data analysis. They've taken interest in the acquisitions which over the last few years to actually improve the case. They've acquired Chewingo, Echo Nest, Seed Scientific and Sonalytic. All of these are focusing around data analysis and a potential future for song recommendations, which is why Spotify is so good at the recommendation area. And in streaming, sharing and stealing, Richard Hillerman was quoted about a question he was asked around big data and like the likes of Google, Netflix, Spotify, and compare it to the instance around the music industry and why there might have been a decline in the music industry as such. The thing he said is you have to remember that decisions in the industry were always based on someone's gut feel and what will sell in the market. And the people with good gut instincts are the ones who rise to power in their companies. The problem is that these companies are now competing against companies like Google, Amazon, Apple, who don't make gut decisions. They make quantitative decisions based on what the data tells them. Spotify noticed a gap in the market, noticed a niche, and they managed to agree a deal with labels where like their success would mean that labels also were successful with the shares in their company. And this all leads into when Spotify announced their IPO, or like some of the labels actually sold some of their shares. So Sony sold half its stake and they made $768 million off the sale for that. We're on to now like how the royalties are calculated, and this is getting back to the crux of the issue with regards to the payouts for streaming. Currently, the thing to like think about for streaming is there's two calculations that are carried out, and it's based on the level of membership you have. This basically goes between premium and advertising revenue. So they're both calculated in the same way, but the payout is actually determined upon how much money is generated. Generally, for premium subscriptions, you get paid more, and for advertising revenue customers, there's a smaller payout. How Spotify calculates the royalty is it takes the number of plays for that region, it divides it by the income that has been generated in that particular region, and then distributes the money accordingly to the rights holders. So advertising revenue is distributed in a similar way, but obviously the revenue generated isn't from memberships or subscriptions, but it's coming from the royalties from the advertisers. One of the issues with this is that the revenue and data that goes from each particular subscriber may not mean that what they've played goes towards that the people that they've been playing and supporting. So it might be that, say like someone's listening to Gomez and that's all they listen to for like the month. When their data goes off, that goes into a big pool, and they might have listened to like maybe 4 hours or something. So then rather than their subscription amount going straight to the artist, so they get a much higher revenue thing, it takes into account someone who might be listening 24/7. You get the situation where a fan of one artist might end up paying for royalties towards like BTS, Taylor Swift or Ed Sheeran, because it all gets put into a pool and distributed accordingly. And this is one of the arguments I think that came up in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. They asked the question, could the royalties be distributed in a fairer way to reflect on what people are actually listening to. And what actually came up from that is that I think some of the major labels who were questioned about that, he said potentially there's a possibility of doing it, but if we did do that, and it would actually break the contracts that we have in place for Spotify. So we'd actually say, no, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So the major labels argued it would be incredibly hard to implement that as a change royalty in changing royalty collection, distribution and calculation. And it also breached Spotify's contract with the major labels to change the royalty calculation method. And if you think these contracts get renegotiated at various times, and they may last for 7-8 years and get reevaluated. The other thing that came up, the royalty distribution from Spotify, is the pooling methods. Actually, it's open for abuse as well. So there was a guy, I think there was a composer or someone who figured out how to, you could basically pay for one Spotify subscription, logged in on about 1,000 computers and played his own music, like 30-second sound to picture clips, and he was generating more revenue from the plays of his own music off his one or two accounts than was actually having to pay out for the money. So it only got picked up by, I think it's a Sony executive who had access to the data, who said, well, there's an anomaly here, and they realized that the amount he was paying out was a fraction of what he was actually generating in the revenue. So that's one of the areas of abuse where I think Spotify changed what's classified as a play now, and it has to be over a certain amount. And this is only concerning music consumption. I've mentioned already, the most profitable subscribers to Spotify come in the form of podcast listeners, because Spotify don't have to pay out for a podcast. Podcasts generally generate their revenue from advertising, but from Spotify's point of view is like all the money then they retain, they don't have to pay out to an artist. Without streaming, would the music industry collapse? Well, yes and no. If streaming disappeared, the industry would adapt like it did after Napster, where we saw like a drop in global income and the revenue generated from the sector. But over time, like new innovations would adapt, and it would mean that there might be an alternative form of consumption, a form of actually record playing. And like we're starting to see now with the likes of Patreon, we're like to see with how people are sort of expanding out of their own platform. So expanding away from traditional methods to actually think of alternative methods to raise money, create awareness, and actually develop a relationship with fans. The question then is, where do we go from here? What's the option? If revenue isn't coming in from streaming, what are the alternative options? I think we're at a stage now where we have to think about music being a much more comprehensive avenue, and it has to be part of a bigger picture. Relying on record sales isn't enough. Even when I was in bands, like say 10 years ago, our main source of income was selling merch, like doing t-shirts, doing CDs, a little bit as a physical product, as a merchandise aspect, and then also other bits and pieces that we used to sell, like glow sticks. Some artists have made podcasts that support bands, others have done fundraising campaigns to actually raise money for the albums. Pledge Music was a massive impact on that. Unfortunately, that kind of went sideways, but there have been other platforms that kind of do that. Websites like Bandzoogle actually offer you the opportunity to actually crowdfund your own recording process. We've also seen collabs and brand partnerships with companies. I know like a band like Those Time Crows, they do their own podcast. They also have they've now started doing partnerships with coffee companies to actually do their own coffees and beers. And you can't knock it, because like the income, what was traditionally available, isn't there anymore. So you have to kind of start thinking outside the box and thinking about what you can do to sustain your career. If it means that you get to focus on your music full time, I haven't got a problem with that whatsoever. The hardest part of this avenue at the moment then is also consistency, thinking outside the box and doing something interesting that connects with your audience and sustains them and builds a relationship. And the relationship is probably the most important part of where we're at the moment. Facebook actually offer like premium streams that you can do straight from there, and you can stream live to your page, and it's something like diversifying that's going to be taken off as well. And that like live streaming obviously has been accelerated because of the lack of live music. What if we actually looked at our art from our artist perspective, our own music, and look at a data-driven approach? That sounds pretty horrendous, but hear me out. What if you actually trial doing a couple of bits and pieces and gathering data in terms of, okay, when's the best time to post, what do people respond to, and actually building on that and actually finding patterns and like repetitions? And can you measure it of what you were doing and when it's successful, and can you measure similar artists and bands and see what they're doing and taking inspiration from them? And this is where I think podcasts have been really good, is like you can find out a lot of information looking at that. You're going to gradually see an increase of improvement of retention, engagement of fans and like downloads and streams. So it's all part of a bigger picture. And then this is also looking at like other artists and seeing what they do on their page. How often do they post? What type of content are they posting? And is there a specific time that they're working on? And then using that information to kind of gauge your audience audience and go from there. And then this is information that I'm hoping that you'll find useful in the future. And the reason about asking this question is I see this a lot with new bands, and this is something that happens quite often, is bands come in, record their record, and they either just chuck it all out in one go, which isn't the best way of doing it. The other thing that goes like, oh, new singles out, download it, oh, it's on the radio, quicker, go see that. It's like, that's great, but you're not engaging, you're not thinking outside the box a little bit. With the way the landscape's going now, we've got to start thinking about diversifying, and we've got to start thinking about, okay, the income from live music might drop out completely, the income from live music might be reduced a lot. Streaming is an option, but it's not completely sustainable in terms of what's available for that, and especially when we're looking at major labels. So something needs to change. What are you guys doing that you think is working really well? What I'd love to do now is actually hear your views on the topic. I mean, what's working well for you guys? What have you found with streaming in terms of your music? Is streaming killing music? Are you making a success from streaming, or was live music even like something that you were interested in? Leave me a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Whilst I have, I've also made this video which I think you'd be interested in. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you all again next time. Nice one, guys.